Imagine waking up one morning to find out your entire kingdom is just gone.
Right, like completely gone.
Yeah, and I mean that quite literally. Picture yourself at the absolute pinnacle of your life, right? You have built a whole society.
You've established a dynasty.
Spot on. You have unparalleled resources and a reputation that stretches across the known world. And then, before the sun even sets, you are fleeing out the back door of your own palace.
Just a total abrupt collapse.
Absolutely. And it is not a foreign invasion, It is not a natural disaster. Your own child has orchestrated this massive, highly coordinated coup.
Which is just a horrific thing to process.
It really is. You are suddenly on the run, watching the very people you trusted, the people you provided for, actively turning against you.
Yeah, your entire support system becomes the threat.
Right. You are isolated, hunted by your own flesh and blood, and forced into the wilderness. Now, the natural human reaction there is absolute paralyzing panic.
Oh, sure. Frantic planning, hypervigilance, just utter despair.
But in the middle of this real historical event, the man at the center of the crosshairs somehow finds the ability to lie down on the hard ground, close his eyes, and fall fast asleep.
It makes no sense from a human perspective.
It really does not. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. We're doing a custom-tailored deep dive today, just for you, into the anatomy of ultimate betrayal.
And the mechanics of divine peace.
Yes. We're using Matthew Poole's 17th century commentary on the third Psalm as our analytical lens today. We want to see how a king processes total collapse and his absolute reliance on a sovereign God.
And, the historical stakes of this text are just staggering.
They really are. Set the scene for us a bit.
Yeah, so we are looking at a moment of unimaginable socio-political and personal crisis. Poole establishes the context immediately, right? He points to the inscription of the text.
Right, the little intro text before the psalm starts.
Yes, it says, Psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom, his son.
Which means we have to look back at the historical record in 2 Samuel to get the full picture.
We do. Because Absalom did not just wake up one day and decide to take the throne.
It was a long game.
Very long. He spent 4 years executing this calculated political long con.
Just standing at the city gates.
Yeah, intercepting people who came to the king for justice. He would essentially tell them, your claim is good, but the king has no one to hear you.
Just totally undermining David's authority.
Spot on. He would say, if I were judge, you would get justice. And 2 Samuel says he systematically stole the hearts of the men of Israel.
So by the time David actually flees, it is not just him running from a petulant kid.
Not at all. He is running from a massive popular uprising. Absalom has completely co-opted his own military and political infrastructure.
Man, that drastically changes how we perceive the flight. It is not just an escape. It is a total repudiation of his life's work by the people he literally saved.
It is a complete rejection, and Poole points out a really fascinating chronological detail about when this text was actually composed.
Oh, right, the timing of it.
Yeah, he notes that the phrase, when he fled, could mean the composition happened during the actual physical flight, with the dust of the road still on his sandals.
While he is actively running for his life.
Yeah. Or, Poole says, the matter was turning over in his thoughts during the crisis, and he structured those raw thoughts into this specific poetic form a little bit later.
Either way, we are looking at real-time trauma processing, but done through a very specific theological framework.
And the structure of that processing is what makes the text so incredibly rich for us to break down.
Well, let's jump right into the text then, because it doesn't start with the peace or the sleep, does it?
No, it starts by staring directly into the abyss of the conspiracy.
Right, verse 1. David says, Lord, how are they increased that trouble me? Many are they that rise up against me.
And Poole drops a very critical historical note here. He says David might well say this because, quote, almost all his people joined in that conspiracy.
Almost all. That is a terrifying phrase.
Yeah.
The sheer volume of the betrayal is the very first psychological hurdle he has to face.
It is.
Let's analyze the sociology of that moment for a second. When almost all the people join a conspiracy against you, it creates this suffocating echo chamber.
It isolates you entirely.
Yeah, because if a small fringe faction attacks you, you can dismiss them. You can rely on your core supporters, right?
You still have your base.
Yes. But when the consensus of the entire society, your generals, your advisors, your citizens, when they all turn against you, it forces a really terrifying internal question.
Which is, what if they are right?
Spot on. If everyone I know thinks I deserve to be overthrown, maybe I actually do. That psychological weight is just crushing.
You are not just fighting an army at that point.
No, you are fighting the unified condemnation of your entire world. Like a massive modern-day cancellation, but with swords.
And that unified condemnation, it escalates immediately. It goes from the political to the theological in the very next verse.
Right. Verse 2 reveals the true nature of the attack.
Yeah. Many there be which say of my soul, there is no help for him in God.
That is heavy. And Poole is very precise about the phrasing there, right?
He is. He explains that the phrase of my soul simply means of me. He notes that the soul is commonly put for the entire person in ancient Near Eastern literature.
So they were attacking him at his core.
Yes, but the core accusation is what we really need to dissect here.
Because the enemies are not simply stating that David's military strategy is flawed, right?
No, or that his political capital is spent. They are declaring a spiritual absolute. They are saying God has utterly forsaken him.
And Poole adds the rationale behind their claim, which is just devastating.
Yeah, Poole says they believe God has forsaken him, quote, for his many crimes and will never help him more.
See, that is the ultimate weaponization of a person's past.
It really is an ugly tactic.
Because David had a very public, very catastrophic moral failure,
Yeah.
with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah.
Everyone knew about it.
Yeah, and the prophet Nathan had explicitly told David that because of those actions, the sword would never depart from his house.
So Absalom rises up and the enemies just connect the dots.
Right. They look at the situation and conclude that this is the final, irrevocable judgment of God.
They're taking David's documented history and using it to convince him that he has exhausted the grace of the covenant.
Which is an incredibly brutal tactic. I mean, it is one thing to have someone shoot arrows at you.
Yeah, physical danger is one thing.
But it is a completely different level of warfare for them to attempt to sever your psychological connection to your sole source of hope.
Because if heaven has closed its doors to you, what is the point of even fighting back?
Exactly. I mean, absolutely. The theological terror of that accusation is just massive.
And in the mindset of ancient Israel, the king's legitimacy was entirely dependent on divine favor.
If the favor is gone, the king is nothing.
Right. So the enemies are exploiting a massive theological vulnerability.
They're basically arguing that the covenant God made with David was conditional, and that David broke the conditions so thoroughly that the contract is null and void.
Yeah, they are saying God has just handed him over to destruction. They are attacking the very mechanics of his justification.
Okay, I want to stop right there, though, and push back on a structural decision made in the text.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, it makes zero logical sense to me. Right after this horrific accusation, there is no help for him in God. We hit the word Selah.
Ah, yes, the Selah.
And Poole explains this word functions as a musical note, right? Directing applause, a short stop, or lengthening of the tune.
Yeah, he says it is placed at remarkable passages to quicken the attention.
But here is my issue with that. Placing a pause right there feels like terrible pacing.
You think so?
Yeah, it feels almost masochistic. If I'm writing an account of my life falling apart and I quote my enemies saying, God hates me and I am doomed, the absolute last thing I'm going to do is pause.
You would want to defend yourself immediately.
Yes, I am going to rush into my defense. I am going to talk over them. Pausing allows the worst possible insult to just linger in the air.
It lets it settle in.
Right, so why force the listener and himself to sit in that specific silence?
Well, because rushing into the defense is a sign of panic. And the text is systematically dismantling panic.
Okay, that is an interesting way to frame it.
Your instinct to talk over the accusation is the natural human reflex to avoid pain, right?
Sure, nobody wants to hear that they are forsaken.
But structurally, forcing a halt right after the enemy's worst accusation compels a confrontation with the void. You cannot just brush past it.
Once you face the music.
Literally, with the musical pause. The theology of the 17th century, which Poole is articulating, demands that you look at the full weight of the law and the full weight of sin before you can understand grace.
You have to feel the condemnation first.
Right. By quickening the attention right at the point of maximum despair, the text creates a tension that desperately requires a resolution.
If you rush through the pain, the comfort feels cheap.
It feels reactionary. By placing the Selah there, David is forcing himself and you as the listener to confront the absolute worst-case scenario.
What if they are right? What if my crimes actually have severed the covenant?
Yes. You sit in that agonizing silence, and only when you have fully absorbed the terror of that possibility does the defense arrive.
I see. So the pause acts as like an anvil.
An anvil. I like that.
Yeah, it provides this hard surface against which The theological pivot of the next verse can strike with maximum force.
That completely flips the perspective, doesn't it?
It really does. The pause is not a surrender at all. It is a calculated absorption of the blow.
It is letting the enemy take their best possible shot, watching it land, and then realizing you are still standing.
Wow. And coming out of that pregnant silence, David completely rejects their theological premise.
He does. He looks at his actual objective standing with God.
Which leads us into the mechanics of divine defense in verse 3. The tone shifts entirely.
Read verse 3 for us.
But thou, O Lord, art a shield for me, my glory and the lifter up of mine head.
The enemies just declared a total absence of God.
And David declares an immediate, localized presence.
The language here is intensely spatial. Poole clarifies the phrase, a shield for me. He says it means about me on every side.
On every side. That is a critical detail.
It is. Poole notes that the shield is precisely where also mine enemies are.
So wherever the threat is, the shield is already there.
Right. We need to understand the military hardware of the time to grasp this properly, though.
Let's unpack that.
The standard infantry shield, the Selah, was large and rectangular. It was meant to protect the front of a soldier in a line of battle.
A wall of wood and leather.
Yeah. And the Magan, which is the Hebrew word used here, was a smaller, round shield. But David alters the physics of the Magan here.
How so?
He says God is a shield about him, not just in front of him.
Let's expand on that, because a physical shield, no matter the shape, is directional.
It only protects one angle at a time.
Right. If you are holding a piece of wood and metal, it only protects the space it physically occupies. If someone swings at your head, you have to raise it.
If they thrust at your legs, you lower it.
Yes. It requires your active energy, your reflexes, and your constant attention to anticipate where the threat is coming from.
It is exhausting just to think about.
It really is. But if you are surrounded by tens of thousands of people, an entire nation conspiring against you, a directional shield is mathematically useless.
Your back is always exposed.
Your flanks are always vulnerable. So what David is describing here operates much more like a modern concept of a localized energy field.
Like a sci-fi force field.
Spot on, a 360-degree force field.
That is a highly accurate way to conceptualize it. And the crucial distinction there is the source of the active energy.
Right, because with a physical shield, the user must stay awake.
They have to stay alert and physically maneuver the defense. The defense is only as good as the user's stamina.
Which, after running into the wilderness, would be zero.
Well, I mean, absolutely. But if the shield is God himself, the defense is omnidirectional. And it is passive for the user.
Because the generator of the shield is the sovereign God.
Right. David does not have to anticipate the angle of the attack because the defense encapsulates him completely.
The threat is ubiquitous, so the protection must be ubiquitous.
Yeah, that is a great way to put it.
And it does not stop at mere physical protection against arrows and swords either.
No, it moves right into the restoration of identity.
Let's look at that. David calls God my glory.
Which is wild given his current situation.
It really is. This is a man who just hours ago was wearing a literal crown, sitting on a throne, dispensing justice for an entire nation.
And now he is climbing the Mount of Olives barefoot.
Weeping, with people literally throwing rocks at him. His physical glory is completely stripped away.
Yet Poole gives two distinct meanings for this phrase that redefine the concept of glory entirely.
What is the first meaning Poole gives?
Poole's first meaning is that God is the author of David's princely glory and majesty.
Okay, so acknowledging the source.
Yeah. Poole phrases the internal logic like this. Thou didst first give it, and I doubt not thou wilt defend and restore it.
So David is making a massive theological concession here.
He really is. He is acknowledging that his kingship, his wealth, and his status were never his own intrinsic achievements.
They were always a divine grant, a gift.
Right. Therefore, the entity that granted the glory retains the right and the capacity to sustain or restore it.
He is detaching his identity from the physical trappings of the throne.
And attaching it to the source of the throne.
Man, that requires a level of ego death that most leaders never, ever achieve.
Oh, for sure. Usually a deposed leader clings desperately to their past victories to justify their worth.
They recount the battles they won, the cities they built. I mean, think about David's resume.
It is unmatched.
He killed Goliath. He slaughtered tens of thousands of Philistines. He expanded the borders of Israel further than anyone before him.
He was a legend in his own time.
Yet, in this moment of total humiliation, he does not point to a single item on his resume.
Because a resume is useless when the society that validated it has decided you are an enemy of the state.
That is such a good point. The resume means nothing if the company's burning down.
Right. Which leads to Poole's second interpretation. He says, my glory means the matter of his glorying, or boasting.
So his reason to boast.
Yes, David expects that God will provide further occasion to boast of divine might and favor. His glory is entirely sourced outside of himself.
And this connects directly to the third title in the verse, right? The lifter up of mine head.
Yes, the physiological imagery there is so compelling.
Think about the physical posture of a person drowning in public disgrace.
It is universal.
It is. When you are caught in a massive failure, when your own family betrays you and the public turns against you, the involuntary physical reaction is to hang your head.
You stare at the ground.
You cannot maintain eye contact with anyone.
Yeah.
The weight of the shame literally pulls your chin down to your chest.
And Poole interprets this phrase as God enabling David to look up to him with comfort and cheerfulness.
To look up.
Yes, and to look at his enemies with confidence. God is lifting him out of the mire and restoring his former dignity.
But the mechanism here is crucial, isn't it?
Highly crucial. It is not David giving himself a pep talk.
It is not a self-help routine.
No. It is not David forcing his own chin up through sheer willpower or stubborn pride.
Because he doesn't have any pride left.
Right. It is an external force acting upon him. The covenant God actively lifts the head, replacing the physical posture of shame with the physical posture of vindication.
It is an external force, absolutely. But it requires an active channel of communication, which is detailed in verse 4.
Right. The communication line.
Verse 4 says, I cried unto the Lord with my voice, and he heard me out of his holy hill. Selah.
And Poole emphasizes the phrase, with my voice.
Why is that significant?
He says it shows the witness of his faith and the fervency of his affections.
I find that interesting because we often think of prayer in a crisis as a silent internal groaning, right?
Like a desperate, quiet thought.
Yeah, but David is actually vocalizing this.
Vocalization makes the plea objective. It moves it from a subjective internal wish to an external, audible declaration of reliance.
He is putting it out into the air.
Yes. But the truly critical theological detail in this verse is the location from which the answer comes.
The holy hill.
Right. Poole notes that his holy hill refers to the hill of Zion.
Which is back in Jerusalem.
Yes, where God was especially present because the Ark of the Covenant was located there.
Right.
Poole explains that the saints in those days used to direct their prayers toward the Ark, and from there, God heard, answered, and blessed them.
We have to look at the historical context of the flight from Jerusalem to fully understand the magnitude of this.
Oh, the incident with the priests.
Yeah, because when David was fleeing the city, the priests, Zadok and Abiathar, actually brought the Ark of the Covenant out of the city to accompany him.
They carried it right out to him on the road.
They did. They thought, logically, that the king needs the ultimate religious artifact to ensure God's presence is with his mobile command center.
It makes perfect sense from a human perspective. Take the ultimate symbol of God's favor with you.
But David stops them. He orders them to take the ark back into the city, back to Zion.
Which is now controlled by Absalom.
Yes. He essentially leaves his most powerful piece of theological leverage in the hands of his enemies.
And he does that because he refuses to treat the ark as a magic talisman.
It is not a good luck charm.
No. He recognizes that God is not a genie confined to a gold-plated box that can be carted around for good luck.
So by sending the ark back to Zion, David is submitting to the sovereign will of God.
He says in 2 Samuel, if I find favor in the eyes of the Lord, he will bring me back.
But verse 4 shows the result of that submission.
It does. Absalom might have physical possession of the ark.
He has the golden box.
Yeah, Absalom might occupy the geographic real estate of Zion, but David has the ear of the God who resides there.
Wow. The covenant communication line is not tied to physical proximity, is it?
Not at all. It is tied to the legal reality of the covenant mediator.
David prays toward the holy hill, and despite the miles of wilderness between them, the sovereign of Zion hears the rightful king.
That makes the situation incredibly localized.
The rebel son has the palace, but the exiled father has the authorization codes.
That is a great analogy.
And because David is surrounded by this omnidirectional force field, and because his head has been lifted by the localized presence on Zion, we witness a biological reaction that makes absolutely zero sense.
Zero sense in a natural evolutionary context.
None at all. This is the pivot point of the entire text. Verse 5 says, I laid me down and slept, I awakened, for for the Lord sustained me.
Let's really break down the sheer biological impossibility of this action.
Please do, because it baffles me.
Well, to understand the impossibility, we have to look at the mechanics of the human nervous system under extreme duress.
Okay, let's get into the science of it.
When a human being is hunted, the sympathetic nervous system takes complete control. The amygdala registers a lethal threat and floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol.
The classic fight-or-flight response.
Right. The heart rate spikes to pump blood to the muscles, the pupils dilate, the digestive system shuts down.
The body is entirely optimized for survival.
Yes, precisely. In this state of hyperarousal, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part responsible for rest, digestion, and sleep, is chemically suppressed.
So you literally cannot sleep.
You cannot. Your biology is screaming at you that unconsciousness equals death.
Everyone has experienced a micro version of this, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Think about the night before a massive, career-defining presentation, or waiting for the results of a critical medical test.
You lie in bed, your mind races.
You toss and turn, staring at the ceiling.
Yeah.
Your body refuses to shut down because your brain perceives a threat to your social or physical well-being.
Even if the threat isn't lethal, your body treats it like a lion in the room.
Right. Now, take that minor anxiety and multiply it by tens of thousands of armed soldiers.
Soldiers who are actively scouring the countryside with the explicit goal of severing your head from your shoulders.
The natural instinct is hypervigilance. You post guards. You stay awake plotting your next move.
You stare into the darkness, waiting for the sound of snapping twigs.
Yes, but David bypasses millions of years of evolutionary survival instincts and just takes a nap.
It is a radical subjugation of biology to theology.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it.
Poole notes this was a secure sleep. David was casting all his cares and fears upon God, relying upon his help and awaking undisturbed.
To voluntarily close your eyes in an active war zone is the ultimate act of relinquishing sovereignty.
It is. When you sleep, you are entirely helpless.
You cannot fight back. You cannot run. You cannot negotiate.
You are admitting that your survival is no longer in your own hands at all.
And the text gives the exact mechanism that allowed the parasympathetic nervous system to override the crisis.
Right. It says, "For the Lord sustained me."
Now, Poole describes this as being supported by God's right hand so he would not fall under his burden.
The Hebrew word here implies being propped up or supported from underneath.
Like a physical pillar.
Yes, Poole explicitly states that God upheld his spirit and his person and his cause.
Notice the comprehensive nature of that sustenance.
It covers everything.
It was not just that David possessed an unusually stoic disposition, or that he practiced really good breathing techniques.
No, the divine right hand was actively sustaining his physical body.
Preventing his mind from shattering under the psychological weight of the betrayal.
And maintaining the legal justice of his cause in the heavenly courts while he was physically unconscious.
So the sleep was not just a natural occurrence. The sleep itself was a supernatural provision.
It was a tangible manifestation of the force field we discussed earlier.
Okay, I am going to challenge the application of this in the very next verse, though.
All right, what is the issue?
Because it seems to cross the line from theological trust into sheer delusion.
Strong words.
Well, look at verse 6. David wakes up and says, "I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people that have set themselves against me round about."
Right.
Now, Poole plainly states that David sees no human way to escape this situation. So, is verse 6 just arrogance?
You think he's boasting?
Is this a politician talking tough for the history books to project a strength he doesn't actually have?
Ah, I see what you're saying.
I mean, it is one thing to have a supernatural peace that allows you to sleep. It is entirely different to wake up, look at a massive, well-armed militia cresting the hill, and declare that you have zero fear.
How is that not just a detachment from objective reality?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I disagree that it is a detachment from reality. In fact, it is an adherence to a higher proven reality.
Okay, prove it to me.
The lack of fear in verse 6 is the strictly logical, empirical conclusion of the experiment conducted in verse 5.
Experiment.
Let's look at the scientific method here. David is surrounded by a lethal threat. He hypothesizes that God is a 360-degree shield.
Okay, setting the hypothesis.
Right. Then he tests that hypothesis by engaging in the most vulnerable act possible, going to sleep.
The ultimate stress test of the shield.
Spot on. 8 hours later, he wakes up, he takes a breath, he realizes his throat has not been cut.
He is still breathing.
The army was out there all night, actively hunting him, and yet he remains entirely unharmed. The only rational explanation for his continued existence is that the sovereign God actively held the perimeter while he was unconscious.
Oh, wow. So the morning light provides the empirical data that validates the night's theology.
Precisely. If God possesses the capacity and the willingness to perfectly protect a completely helpless, unconscious man from 10,000 armed soldiers.
Why should that man fear those same soldiers when he is awake and capable of moving?
Exactly. The sustenance of the night guarantees the protection of the day.
That is a phenomenal connection.
His fear dissipates not because the size of the enemy army has shrunk. I mean, they are still there. They're still heavily armed.
The threat is physically identical.
Yes. But the scale and efficacy of God's protecting capacity have been vividly, undeniably demonstrated. He has field-tested the shield, and it held.
That structural link is just flawless. The sleep isn't just rest, it is the laboratory where the covenant is proven.
That is a great way to summarize it.
But the fact remains that the external threat is still physically present. The rebel army hasn't packed up and gone home just because David got 8 hours of rest.
No, they are still coming for him.
Which brings us to a significant shift in the text. David moves from the passive trust of sleep to a plea for active, decisive intervention.
Right, verse 7.
He says, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. For thou hast smitten all mine enemies upon the cheekbone. Thou hast broken the teeth of the ungodly."
The language shifts violently from defense to offense.
Very violently.
Poole notes that arise means to bestir oneself, to be no longer an idle spectator of miseries.
Which echoes the ancient invocation from Numbers chapter 10, doesn't it?
Yes, where Moses would say, "Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered," whenever the Ark of the Covenant set out.
So David is calling for the localized presence on Zion to go to war.
He is, but the most revealing phrase here is, "Oh my God."
Let's analyze that, because it sounds like a standard religious exclamation to modern ears. Just something you say in shock.
But in this context, it operates much more like a legal summons.
A legal summons. Unpack that for us.
It is entirely legal and relational. Poole points out that this implies a special relation and a specific covenant.
Okay.
David is speaking as a son and a servant, saying, "Lord, save thine own."
Save thine own. That changes the tone completely.
This is the core mechanism of Reformed thought regarding the covenant framework. David is not appealing to a generalized abstract deity who might impartially weigh the scales of karma and decide who wins the battle.
He isn't just hoping for good luck from the universe.
No, he is appealing to a possessive, binding agreement. By saying, "my God," he is invoking the specific promises God made to him in 2 Samuel chapter 7.
The promise to establish his throne forever.
Right. He is essentially saying, "I am your anointed representative. My enemies are, by definition, your enemies.
My destruction would be a violation of your sworn oath.
Therefore, my preservation is tied directly to your cosmic reputation."
It is an intensely legal yet intensely familial demand for intervention.
And the mechanism of that intervention is described with incredibly graphic physical violence.
Yeah, he says God has smitten the enemies upon the cheekbone and broken the teeth of the ungodly.
This is a massive contrast to the peaceful imagery of the sleep we just discussed.
It really is jarring. Poole explains that striking the cheekbone implies contempt and reproach.
It is a degrading blow.
It is the kind of strike that causes smartness and soreness, as Poole says, but it is primarily an insult. It's a slap in the face.
A public humiliation.
But the second half of the imagery is what really stands out.
The breaking of the teeth.
Yeah.
Poole says the teeth represent their strength and the instruments of their cruelty. He notes that David frequently compares his enemies to wild beasts.
Lions, wolves, bears.
Right. The blow disenables them from doing the mischief they desired and were accustomed to doing to others.
This requires a very specific analogy, I think. Think about the mechanics of dealing with an apex predator.
Okay, let's hear it.
If you were trapped in a room with a venomous snake or a wolf, the threat is entirely localized in the mouth.
The fangs.
The fangs, the crushing power of the jaw. If you somehow manage to knock out the teeth of that beast, you have radically altered the dynamic of the room.
You've neutralized the primary weapon.
Right. The beast is still physically present. It might still be pacing around you, growling, filled with the desire to kill you.
But its mechanism for cruelty has been entirely neutralized.
It can no longer puncture your skin. It can no longer crush your bones. The danger has been mitigated at the exact source of its capacity.
That is a highly accurate representation of what David is praying for and what Poole is highlighting.
It is not about making the enemy disappear.
No, God does not always vaporize the enemy. He does not always remove the threat from the geographic vicinity. Often, the method of divine salvation is active disarmament.
Shattering the weapons.
God shatters the instruments used to spew spiritual poison and physical threats.
And if we connect this back to verse 2.
Oh, the accusation.
Yeah. The enemies were using their mouths to attack David's soul, saying there is no help for him in God.
Now, God is pictured as breaking the very teeth in those mouths.
It is a severe, definitive justice that perfectly matches the crime.
And this explains the peace. David can sleep peacefully only because he trusts that the sovereign God is entirely capable of enacting this brutal reality.
He doesn't have to stay awake, sharpening his own sword, because he knows the covenant God is out in the dark, systematically defanging the wolves that are circling the camp.
The severity of God's justice against the wicked is the necessary foundation for the righteous man's peace.
You cannot have the peaceful sleep without the broken teeth.
They are two sides of the identical covenant coin. Protection for the mediator requires destruction of the mediator's enemies.
Which brings us to the final conclusion of the text.
Yeah.
Having asked God to dismantle the predatory capacity of the rebellion, David concludes the psalm by correctly identifying the true source of victory.
And then he does something regarding his enemies that defies every standard rule of ancient warfare.
Verse 8 says, "Salvation belongeth unto the Lord. Thy blessing is upon thy people." Selah.
Let's take the first half of that equation. Salvation belongeth unto the Lord.
Poole comments that David expects salvation not from his forces, but from God's favor alone.
We have to pause and recognize how historically bizarre this statement is coming from this specific man.
Because David is a legendary warrior king.
His entire rise to power was based on his military genius. He has an elite group of soldiers, his mighty men, who are renowned for their lethal efficiency.
Yet in the defining crisis of his reign, he explicitly disavows his military apparatus as the source of his salvation.
He rejects militarism entirely.
It is a staggering theological submission. A monarch's entire security paradigm is built on his standing army, his defensive walls, his supply lines, and his tactical superiority.
It is all about logistics and numbers.
Right. Later in his life, David actually fails this exact test by ordering a census to count his troops, relying on human math for security.
But here, in his finest theological moment, he strips all the human math away.
He attributes salvation entirely and exclusively to the Lord.
He recognizes that swords and shields are useless if the divine favor is withdrawn.
But the second half of the verse is where the depth of David's character and the complexity of the theological framework truly emerges.
Thy blessing is upon thy people.
Now, Poole reads this as a closing prayer, meaning, let thy blessing be upon thy people.
And Poole offers two distinct interpretations for who thy people refers to in this context.
What is the first interpretation?
The first interpretation is standard. The prayer is for his friends and followers, who alone are God's true people, while the rest are rebels to God as well as to David.
That makes perfect logical sense. You pray for the loyalists who are suffering with you in the wilderness.
Of course. But the second interpretation is the one that forces a complete reevaluation of leadership.
Let's hear it.
Poole suggests the prayer might be for all thy people, Israel.
Including the rebels.
Yes. And if it is for the entirety of Israel, Poole outlines a three-part objective for this prayer.
Break those down for us.
First, to preserve his friends. Second, to convince and convert his enemies. Third, to save the body of the nation from being brought to utter ruin by this civil war.
I have to challenge the logic of this from a human perspective.
Go for it.
How rare is this attitude in human history? When a leader is betrayed by their own citizens, and specifically by their own flesh and blood.
The immediate desire is revenge.
It is a desire for a massive purge. You want vindication. You want the rebellion crushed, the leaders executed, and the populace humiliated into submission.
You want to salt the earth so they can never rise against you again.
Right. So my question is, how can David logically pray for a blessing on the very people he just compared to wild beasts?
It seems contradictory.
Just one verse ago, he was asking God to shatter their teeth. Now he is praying for their conversion and the preservation of their society.
It is a massive shift.
How do you reconcile the broken teeth with the requested blessing?
You reconcile it by understanding the unique psychological and spiritual burden of a covenant mediator.
Explain that.
David is not acting as a private citizen seeking personal revenge for a slight. He is the anointed king of God's covenant people.
So his role dictates his response.
Yes. His heart must reflect the requirements of that specific office. The goal of a true mediator is never merely personal survival, nor is it the vindictive annihilation of the opposition.
What is the ultimate goal, then?
The ultimate goal is the restoration of the whole community under the rule of law.
So the destruction of the teeth is a means to an end, not the end itself.
Absolutely. If he only wanted revenge, he would let the nation consume itself in a bloody civil war. But by praying for the conversion of his enemies, he is seeking a solution that heals the structural rupture of the society.
To desire that the rebels be convinced of their error and brought back into the fold is an extraordinary display of grace.
It really is. It shows that even while running for his life, sleeping in the dirt, David understands that the people hunting him are still, fundamentally, the sheep of God's pasture.
Sheep who have been deceived by a usurper and gone violently astray.
Right. He wants the teeth broken so they cannot inflict lethal harm on the righteous. But he wants the hearts converted so the nation can survive and fulfill its covenant purpose.
It is a masterful, delicate balance of strict justice and expansive mercy.
Rooted entirely in his understanding of God's sovereign jurisdiction over the hearts of men.
He wants the capacity for violence destroyed, but he wants the perpetrators redeemed.
That perfectly synthesizes the brutal realism of verse 7 with the sweeping grace of verse 8.
It provides a complete structural framework for how to process catastrophic opposition.
Let's trace the full narrative arc we have analyzed today, just to bring it all together.
Yeah, let's review the progression. We started with the sociology of ultimate betrayal, a man fleeing from a massive conspiracy orchestrated by his own son.
Facing the suffocating psychological weight of public consensus against him.
We examined this specific spiritual attack, weaponizing his past sins to claim that God had completely abandoned him.
We analyzed the structural necessity of the Selah, the mandatory pause to confront the void of that terrifying accusation.
The anvil. And from that pause, we watched the text pivot to the mechanics of divine defense.
We saw the invocation of the 360-degree omnidirectional force field, where the sovereign God acts as the active generator of protection.
We looked at the physiological restoration of dignity, the external force lifting the head from the posture of shame,
Fueled by a localized legal communication with the covenant God on Zion.
which led to the biological anomaly of the 5th verse. We broke down the mechanics of the nervous system under lethal threat and witnessed the supernatural suppression of hyperarousal.
Allowing a hunted man to sleep securely because he was actively sustained from underneath by a divine hand.
We saw how waking up from that sleep provided the empirical data to conquer the fear of 10,000 men.
We then analyzed the legal summons for active intervention, the defanging of the apex predator, mitigating the threat at its source.
And finally, we saw a warrior king reject militarism, assuming the posture of a mediator to pray for the conversion and preservation of the very people trying to kill him.
It is a rigorously logical progression from absolute despair to sovereign peace, and finally, to an expansive national grace.
That concludes our deep dive into these texts. As we wrap up this analysis, we want to leave you with a philosophical question derived directly from the mechanics we just unpacked.
Consider the balance of justice and mercy exhibited in the final verses.
When facing systemic opposition or deep personal betrayal, the modern instinct is often to demand total destruction of the opposing side.
Or, conversely, to offer a passive tolerance that ignores the necessity of justice altogether.
Does David's model, praying for the literal disarmament of the threat while simultaneously seeking the conversion and preservation of the attackers, offer a superior, more sustainable framework for conflict resolution?
How does recognizing a sovereign 360-degree defense alter the way we engage with those who seek our ruin?
Think about the Selah moments in your own life. When you hear the voices saying there is no help for you, do you rush to defend yourself? Or do you pause, recognize your covenant standing, and let God be the lifter of your head? Thank you for listening to this analysis. We will see you next time.